Habitat 3 is about to you. I hope to understand it by the time it ends, or maybe a year or two after that. But I am going to talk about one project that is close to my own heart and that of Juan Close, the director of UN Habitat, which is about built form in the city. How should it be built? And the way in which this project is organized is to try to rethink probably the most influential architectural and planning document of the 20th century, which was called the Charter of Athens for the 21st century. So this is a new Charter of Athens project led by myself, Saskia, and Richard Burdett from the London School of Economics. And what we're going to deliver is a report. You know, we're hoping that it doesn't lie on the shelf. And we're hoping that this report will challenge designers in particular, designers of physical space, built form in the city, to rethink what they're doing. So I'm going to tell you, since this is very brief about this, what the original charter was about, a mental guide that we're using to think about this new kind of charter, and what we hope to accomplish. The original Charter of Athens was written in 1933, and it was driven by Le Corbusier. It also involved people like Siegfried Gideon, Walter Gropius. It was a charter written on a boat because most of these people had been kicked out of Germany, and they took a boat from Athens. And as the boat, evidently the seas were very rough and they were all seasick. But in between being seasick, they wrote a charter in conjunction with studies they had done of 33 cities and their urban plans about urban form. The focus of all of this was how to build a city rationally. That is, how to do something which was not just ad hoc and subject to the vagaries of whatever capitalist investment you could get, but something that followed a logical form. And for this, they drew on a model of urban development, first pioneered by Le Corbusier in 1924-1925, called the Plan Voisin for Paris. And don't show me slides, but it was very wicked of me, but it's because it's a visual talk, but that's how it is. The Plan Voisin was basically the first exercise in grade flat and rebuild. The idea was to grade flat the Marais part of Paris, which was the cholera and tuberculosis seat of Paris. It was an old quarter, which had once been aristocratic and then had fallen on bad days, supposedly. And it was home to basically the city's Jews and the poor foreign workers living in the city. The housing stock was degraded, there's bad sewage, etc. So Corbusier's plan was to destroy it all and start fresh in a rational way by building a set of towers surrounded by open space, putting the traffic as much as possible below ground, making a vertical city, Paris is a horizontal city, as you know, and making every relationship in this plan voisin logically coherent, so that the housing related to where people shopped, where medical facilities were, the traffic sorted out foot traffic from automobile traffic, etc. It was a plan which was incredibly powerful, though not in Paris. It became, via the Charter of Athens, this rationalized city, the model for planning used by the IMF, by the World Bank, by private funders as well, when they thought about how to do development. Development should be rationalized like this. Form and function should fit together. The city should be in equilibrium. These were the three elements of what became the Charter of Athens. That there's a rational fit between form and function. That the parts of the city all fit together, they work together, and that the city is in equilibrium, or as we now say today, it's got a sustainable form. For designers like myself, it's a plan to hate, because essentially what it does is destroy how people have developed ways to live in order to insert a plan about the way they should live. And although it has many virtues, it's become a tyrannical plan which has enabled the kind of, not the kind of development you're talking about, but the kind of World Bank development which will eradicate a place to make a new place which is better along these lines. So we have thought about how to get out of this box of the old Charter of Athens. And I can't describe this to you very elaborately, but basically we made use of something called open systems theory to think about a new way of doing built environment planning. And I'm going to just read you a little about what that's about what open systems theory is about. There are two ways to conduct a laboratory experiment. Researchers work within a closed orbit when performing an experiment to prove or disprove a hypothesis. The original proposition governs procedures and observations. The denouement of the experiment lies in judging whether the hypothesis is correct or incorrect. In another way of experimenting, researchers will take seriously unforeseen turns of data, which may cause them to jump tracks and think outside the box. They will ponder contradictions and ambiguities, stewing in these difficulties for a while, rather than immediately trying to solve them or sweep them aside or rationalize them. The first kind of experiment is closed in the sense that it answers a fixed question, yes or no. Researchers in the second kind of experiment are working more openly because they're asking questions which can't be answered that way. I have to say that this difference struck me when I went to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology to teach. The MIT Media Lab was near my office, the famous Media Lab in the 90s. Its rumpled, smelly researchers who never seemed to sleep explained the difference between a Microsoft-level project and an MIT-level project as follows. The Microsoft project packages existing knowledge while MIT unpackages it. Microsoft thinks closed, the Media Lab thinks open. Now, whether this is fair or not to Microsoft, which paid for the Media Lab, MIT researchers, being on the whole an adventurous lot, tended to snoot closed experiments as mundane and were aroused when a problem rose unbidden, opening up their minds. Now, we've taken, there's a whole model of thinking about this kind of investigation, which is called open systems or complexity theory, which is based on just a contrast like this. And what we're doing in writing this new Charter of Athens is trying to think in a more open way about cities as open systems. And I'm going to tell you three ways that, and I should say about this, the Microsoft model, as MIT researchers thought about it, is all about best practices. The open systems model, the MIT model, is about what kind of practices? What are you doing? It's about experiment rather than best practice. So when we began thinking about this project, we thought, how can we use this mindset, and there's a set of techniques behind it, to think about, outside the box, about urban form. And, gosh, I'll tell you briefly what we've come to and what this new Charter of Athens project is going to be about. First, it emphasized the element of porosity within the city. That is, those ambiguous edges between spaces, places, and functions in the city, rather than neatly separating them out and rationalizing them, as Corbusier did. Look at where they intersect. For Corbusier, for instance, the highway was a neat separator, socio-economic separator. And if you go to Caracas or many other developing cities, you can see how the planners use that. They put all their eggs, as it were, into the highway as a social divider between, say, informal settlements and bourgeois settlements. Our notion is to look at the edges more porous. The same thing between housing and work, rather than rigidly separate things out functionally, to look at the ways in which we no longer build something called an office park, but we build a place where people worked, which was interleaved with places in which they lived or went to school or were treated for disease. So the notion of this first emphasis is about undoing the logic of the neat fit between form and function and replacing it by research into more porous boundaries between both social groups and between functions in the city. The second is to give a much greater privilege to informality than the old Charter of Athens did. For the generation of Corbusier, Walter Gropius, these heroic architects and designers of the last century, formality was a way of definition, was a political commitment. That is, when you decided to make a form, you decided to commit to something that that costs money, whose political boundaries could be specified, and so on. We know about cities today, however, that not only are informal settlements the dominant way of life for many of those people who are displaced that Saskia was talking about, but that the condition of informality is one that invites greater participation of users in the making of space. Now, it might seem odd to you to think about designing informality. You know, you think it just happens. That's what Jane Jacobs thought. It just happens. And here, we don't buy that. We believe that certain kind of spaces can be designed so that they are more amenable to being used informally by different people, different times of the day, for instance, that their purposes would change from week to week, that the spaces could be reused for different purposes when new groups move into the city, and so on. Both porosity and informality are for us political as well as design concepts. A porous edge means that you don't have Muslims and Christians living in different parts of Beirut. They live together. Or may I say Jews and Muslims in Jerusalem. They live together. The boundaries between them are porous. And informality means that their relationships are not legislated, and the spaces that they live in can encourage people to interact in an informal, unprescribed, but face-to-face manner. In this regard, I want to say one thing I noticed about the discussion here is that, maybe I'm wrong in this, that what you have yet to do is distinguish place from space. As I understand a space, it has certain formal properties which allow people to then interact socially. Without those formal properties, without the input of what people like me do, of course, this is very self-interested, the interaction may disperse, people may not focus on each other, the container might be too rigid. There is a way in which you have to think how the physical enables the social, and not being indifferent to that kind of relationship. And finally, we're interested in the Charter on the phenomenon of incompleteness, particularly on incomplete form. None of this is possible if we build fixed, fully articulated structures. The old Charter of Athens put an enormous pressure on politicians to realize a plan that was known in advance, where you could see what you were getting, you know, you knew what you were buying, what you were signing up to, that the designer would provide the authorities with an image of what something was ultimately going to be. That was considered a rational form of development. And what we're looking at is forms which, on the contrary, have a kind of DNA which can develop over time as people interact with it. That is, which are incomplete forms. This is a really technically difficult challenge because it involves building infrastructure, for instance, that can be altered. And that means, in many cases, redundant structures of water or electricity. It's expensive. So part of our research for getting this more flexible form is to see how we can combine flexibility with infrastructure, with an infrastructure that allows that to happen. In the case of informalized settlements, for instance, we're trying to look at the ways in which the provision of sewage pipes can allow people to experiment with different kinds of ways of providing themselves with water and getting rid of waste over the course of time. We're not going to present an idea of how you should build a waste system. That's an image. That's the old Corbusian model. So these then are the three aspects of this new Charter of Athens. It focuses on porosity, informality, and incomplete form. It invites the user of space to become more its designer and articulator as well. That's its political point. I noticed you had also used the, said you have a preference for bottom-up design. In my view, that's the wrong way to think about physical development. It's neither bottom-up nor top-down. It's a different kind of political model in which what we need to do is figure out ways in which technical expertise can both assist people in thinking about what the spaces they want to live in, and can also suggest to them things that people themselves don't know that they might like to live in. So I don't know whether we have to get this written by the time of Quito, and I hope you've all made your hotel reservations, because Quito does not have a surplus of hotel reservations. But what we hope to achieve by this model of the open city in this new Charter of Athens is something that's more participatory and more enabling both to the designer and to the public. Thank you very much.